What if I told you that one of Africa's poorest nations, one you've probably never thought twice about, just shattered history by paying off a staggering $4.79 billion in national debt without taking a single dime from the West? Sounds impossible, right? Sounds like the kind of story that couldn't happen in the world we think we know, but this isn't some fairy tale, it's real. And the nation at the center of this seismic shift? Burkina Faso, a landlocked country in West Africa that the world had long written off as a hopeless case. Poor, unstable, forever dependent, or so they said. But today Burkina Faso is flipping the script, rewriting its destiny, and sending a bold message to every nation still shackled by the chains of foreign aid. We don't need you anymore. For decades, we've been taught to believe that Africa is incapable of standing on its own, that without the financial support of the West, the IMF loans, the World Bank projects, the endless streams of conditional aid, African nations would collapse into chaos and ruin. It's a belief so deeply ingrained that it feels almost natural. But what if it was never true? What if that narrative was designed to keep Africa exactly where it is, dependent, vulnerable, controlled? Today, Burkina Faso is daring to ask that uncomfortable question, and their answer is shaking the foundation of global power as we know it. In 2024, the unthinkable happened. Dr. Apollinaire Joachim Kielem de Tambela, the Prime Minister of Burkina Faso, stepped before his people and the world to announce that they had done what no one believed possible. The more $79 billion paid back in full. No IMF bailouts, no World Bank handouts, no emergency assistance from former colonial powers. Against every odd, and in the face of withering pressure, Burkina Faso had reclaimed its financial freedom. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't luck. It was a deliberate act of financial defiance, a declaration that they would no longer play by the rules of a system designed to keep them in debt and dependence. But let's be clear, this wasn't just about paying bills. This was about something far bigger. It was a bold, almost reckless, gamble on a future they would build themselves without waiting for permission, without begging for rescue. In a world where entire economies are engineered to stay submissive, Burkina Faso refused to kneel. Instead, they turned inward. They chose to believe in the power of their own people, their own markets, their own resources. They chose the hard path, the lonely one. And somehow, against everything history said should happen, they succeeded. Yet behind this incredible feat lies an even deeper mystery. How exactly did a nation plagued by insurgencies, political turmoil, and economic isolation manage to outmaneuver the very institutions designed to hold it back? How did a country written off as a financial basket case find a way to not just survive, but to win? Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain. We're stepping into the real story behind the headlines, the sacrifices, the betrayals, the impossible decisions that led to this moment. And believe me, it's not what you think. Because this isn't just a financial success story, it's a revolution. And if you think Burkina Faso's battle is over, think again. Stay with us, because what comes next will change everything. You thought you knew about Africa, about power, and about what's truly possible when a nation decides to fight for its own destiny. When Burkina Faso stood at the edge of financial collapse, the world waited for the inevitable. The expectation was clear. This tiny, landlocked nation, battered by insurgencies and political chaos, would have no choice but to come crawling, and back to the international lenders. Back to the IMF, back to the World Bank, back to the same cycle of debt, dependency, and defeat. That's how the system was supposed to work. That's how it had always worked. But something extraordinary happened. Instead of reaching out for another lifeline woven in chains, Burkina Faso turned inward. In an act of almost reckless bravery, they made a decision that stunned even their own allies. They would solve this crisis not by begging the world for help, but by betting everything on their own people. No Western bailouts, no foreign loans, no quiet deals in smoke-filled rooms. They would trust the heart of their own nation, the banks, the businesses, the everyday citizens, to lift them out of the abyss. It was a decision born not out of desperation, but out of conviction. The leadership, led by Prime Minister Dr. Apollinaire Joachim Kielem de Tambela and President Ibrahim Traoré, understood one brutal truth. The only way to truly break free was to never ask for chains in the first place. They set their strategy into motion with quiet precision. Instead of knocking on the doors of international banks, they opened the doors of their own domestic markets. Burkina Faso began issuing government bonds, but not to the usual foreign players. These bonds were designed for locals, small business, owners, regional banks, pension funds, even individual citizens with savings tucked away under mattresses. At first, the idea sounded insane. Who would invest in a government barely hanging on to stability, in a nation so fragile, so vulnerable? Logic dictated that in times of uncertainty, capital flees, investors hide, markets dry up. And yet, here was Burkina Faso asking its people to do the exact opposite, not to flee, but to believe. It wasn't blind faith that they were banking on. It was a calculated move based on a deeper shift that had been quietly growing beneath the surface for years. Across Burkina Faso, a new sense of national pride had been taking root. A quiet, stubborn belief that maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to play by the old rules anymore. The leadership recognized that spark and fanned it into a flame. They didn't just ask for trust, they earned it. The government rolled out sweeping reforms to make the financial system more transparent. They launched campaigns promoting fiscal discipline, showing exactly where money would go, how it would be used, and why it mattered. Infrastructure projects were prioritized, with real, visible results. Roads repaired, energy grids expanded, schools built. Every project completed wasn't just another development box checked. It was a signal to the people. We are serious. We are capable. We are building a nation, not borrowing one. Little by little, the tide began to turn. Banks that had once hesitated now started buying government bonds. Pension funds, seeing the government's new track record of fiscal responsibility, began investing as well. Even small business owners, merchants, and everyday workers found ways to contribute, putting their money not into hiding but into the future of their country. A financial system that had once been hollowed out by dependency and fear was now being rebuilt from the ground up, with the people themselves holding the bricks. The impact was immediate and electrifying. Investor confidence soared. Money that once might have fled to Swiss accounts or under-the-table deals was now flowing back into the veins of the nation. The government, once crippled by debt, suddenly found itself breathing again. Not because someone else had saved them, but because they had saved themselves, and it wasn't just about the money. It was about the mindset. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso wasn't begging for survival. It was planning for growth. It was investing not just in bridges and mines, but in dignity, in pride, in sovereignty. Every bond bought wasn't just an investment. It was an act of rebellion. Every project completed wasn't just infrastructure. It was a bullet fired against the old narrative that Africa must always be dependent. But this path wasn't without its dangers. Embedding everything on local faith meant that failure wasn't just political, it would be personal. If they faltered, it wouldn't just be foreign creditors knocking at the door, it would be their own people whose hopes would collapse into ashes. The stakes weren't measured in dollars or euros, they were measured in trust, in pride, in the fragile dreams of millions. Burkina Faso had chosen the harder road. They had gambled not just their economy, but their national soul, and for now it was working. But as anyone who has ever fought an impossible battle knows, winning one fight doesn't end the war. It only sets the stage for the next, harder one, because trusting your people is one thing. Keeping them believing when everything around you falls apart is something else entirely. Just when it seemed like Burkina Faso had found a way forward, just when the impossible had started to look real, the world showed its true face. Instead of applause, instead of respect for a nation trying to stand on its own, Burkina Faso was met with something else entirely: betrayal. After the 2022 military coup that toppled the previous civilian government, many expected the West to step in with negotiations, dialogue, maybe even conditional support. But that's not what happened. Instead, the European Union, along with the usual chorus of Western powers, chose to do the one thing guaranteed to cripple a nation already fighting to breathe. They froze financial aid. They suspended development programs. They imposed crushing sanctions designed not to correct the country's path, but to break its spirit. The message was brutal in its clarity. If you don't play by our rules, we will make you pay. Burkina Faso wasn't just abandoned in its hour of need. It was deliberately isolated, punished, economically strangled. No aid, no collaboration, no understanding, only pressure, only punishment. All because they refused to bow, refused to let foreign institutions dictate the terms of their future. For decades, the West had cloaked its control of Africa in the language of partnership, of mutual development. But here, stripped of polite diplomacy, the truth stood naked. This was never about helping Africa. It was about control, influence, compliance. And when Burkina Faso dared to defy that control, dared to chart its own path, the mask slipped and the fist tightened. The sanctions weren't some minor slap on the wrist. They were a calculated act of destabilization. By freezing aid and development funds, the West hoped to cripple Burkina Faso's fragile recovery. They bet that the already strained economy would collapse without their lifelines. They bet that internal dissent would rise, that the people would turn against their new leadership. They bet that President Ibrahim Traoré and his government would be forced to their knees, begging for re-entry into the old system of subjugation. But they were wrong. Because while the world turned its back, Ibrahim Traoré stood firm. Faced with overwhelming external pressure and the internal chaos of insurgencies, poverty, and political unrest, he made a decision so rare in global politics that it stunned even his enemies. He chose not to yield. He chose not to apologize, not to bargain, not to compromise the nation's hard-fought independence. We will stand or fall by our own hands, he declared. A simple statement, yet one carrying the full weight of defiance. No IMF rescue packages. No secret backdoor negotiations. No desperate appeals to Western capitals. If Burkina Faso was to survive, it would survive on its own terms, or not at all. It was a stance that many called reckless. Critics warned of economic collapse, political anarchy, humanitarian disaster. In a world engineered around dependency, self-reliance wasn't just radical, it was suicidal. But Traoré understood something the West had overlooked. Real power doesn't come from foreign approval. It comes from owning your destiny, no matter the cost. As aid froze and sanctions bit deeper, Burkina Faso didn't crumble as predicted. Instead, they dug in. The leadership doubled down on mobilizing domestic savings, encouraging banks, businesses, and citizens to invest directly in their country's survival. The same financial strategies that had been seeded before the sanctions, local bond issuance, public-private partnerships, resource-backed guarantees, now became lifelines. It wasn't easy. Every step forward felt like a battle. Without foreign grants flowing in, the government had to make painful decisions, delaying non-essential projects, cutting unnecessary expenses, stretching limited resources across critical sectors. Inflation spiked, pressure mounted, voices of doubt grew louder. Yet against all odds, the people stayed. They stayed because they understood what was at stake. This wasn't just about money, it wasn't just about debt. It was about dignity, about refusing to be treated as pawns on someone else's chessboard, about breaking, once and for all, the cycle of dependency that had stolen Africa's future for generations. And so the impossible continued. Gold revenues, one of Burkina Faso's few natural advantages, were strategically leveraged to back the domestic financial system. New financial products were created to attract local investors of every scale, from major banks to small merchants. Infrastructure development continued, albeit slower, fueled by domestic capital and driven by the unwavering belief that survival meant building, not begging. The world watched, half in disbelief, half in anger, as the nation refused to collapse on schedule. Behind the scenes, pressure campaigns escalated. Diplomatic cables buzzed. Financial institutions quietly tightened their grip on neighboring states, warning them against offering Burkina Faso any support. The unspoken threat was clear. Help them, and you'll pay too. Burkina Faso was alone. Economically isolated, politically outcast. Surrounded on all sides by forces waiting for them to fail, and yet they did not. They clung to their strategy, their vision, and above all, their pride. They refused to sell their sovereignty for short-term survival. They refused to mortgage their future for a seat at the table of those who had never truly wanted them there in the first place. The West, for all its power, had made one critical miscalculation. It underestimated the strength of a people who have nothing left to lose but their chains. It underestimated the will of a nation determined to stand free, even if standing meant standing alone. Every month that passed without Burkina Faso collapsing was a quiet revolution against centuries of foreign domination. Every bond purchased by a local citizen, every project completed with local funds, every farmer, merchant, teacher, or soldier who chose to believe in their nation's future, each was an act of defiance louder than any speech, stronger than any sanction. And so, as the world watched and waited for Burkina Faso to fall, the real story was unfolding quietly behind the scenes. A people rediscovering their power, a nation forging a new path through the wreckage of broken promises and broken systems. Of course, the road ahead remained treacherous. Economic storms loomed. Security threats persisted. The forces aligned against them were powerful, patient, and merciless. But the greatest battle, the battle for belief, had already been fought and won. Still, a haunting question lingers. When the world turns its back on you, when enemies tighten the noose and friends disappear, will your own people still stand by you? Or will fear, hunger, and doubt tear the dream apart from within? The answer to that question would decide not just the fate of Burkina Faso, but the future of an entire continent daring to imagine a different destiny. Stay tuned. Burkina Faso's refusal to bow under sanctions wasn't just a story of survival. It was the beginning of something far greater. What started as a desperate gamble had now evolved into a bold economic blueprint, a roadmap not just for Burkina Faso but for every nation that dares to dream of true independence. It began with gold. Burkina Faso, despite its economic struggles, sits atop rich veins of gold, one of its most precious assets. Historically, that wealth had been siphoned off by foreign corporations, exported under deals that left little behind for the nation itself. But under the new leadership, that was about to change. The government made a strategic decision. Instead of letting foreign investors dictate the terms, Burkina Faso would leverage its own gold reserves as collateral to back its domestic bonds. This wasn't just a clever financial trick, it was a revolutionary act of self-empowerment. By anchoring government bonds to tangible natural resources, they gave investors something priceless: security. For the first time, buying into Burkina Faso's future wasn't just an act of hope. It was a safe, smart, and profitable investment. Local banks, pension funds, and businesses, once hesitant, now had every reason to trust. Their money wasn't floating on promises. It was secured by the very land they lived on. At the same time, Burkina Faso knew that survival meant innovation. They couldn't rely on old models or outdated systems. So they began diversifying their financial offerings, creating new instruments like bond options, giving small-scale investors, ordinary citizens, and local businesses access to profitable, government-backed financial products. No longer was investing in the nation's future something reserved for foreign elites or giant banks. Now, a farmer, a shopkeeper, a school teacher could become a stakeholder in the nation's destiny. Every bond bought, every dollar invested, every act of faith, no matter how small, became a brick in the new foundation being laid for the country's future. It wasn't just about raising money to pay down debt. It was about transforming the very way the country thought about wealth, ownership, and power. The formula behind Burkina Faso's unexpected success became clear: trust plus resources plus vision, economic freedom, trust, the belief that your own people, if given the chance, would invest in something greater than themselves. Resources, understanding that real wealth was already within their own borders, not waiting in foreign banks. Vision, the courage to imagine a future not chained to the approval of international creditors or the fluctuating whims of Western politics. And together, these forces created something that the world couldn't understand: resilience. While the West tried to suffocate them with sanctions, Burkina Faso used the pressure as fuel. Every setback was turned into an opportunity to deepen local markets. Every crisis became a catalyst for reinvention. Infrastructure projects didn't stall, they evolved. Focus shifted to sustainable, long-term growth sectors: transportation, energy, mining. Instead of asking, "Who will save us?" the nation asked, "How do we save ourselves?" And the answers they found were powerful. Investments in transportation networks linked previously isolated regions, creating new internal markets. Energy projects focused on renewable resources like solar and hydro, reducing dependence on expensive foreign fuels. Mining reforms redirected profits back into national development funds instead of leaking wealth abroad. Slowly, brick by brick, Burkina Faso wasn't just paying off its debt, it was building an economy designed to withstand future storms. But perhaps the most profound shift wasn't economic at all. It was psychological. A nation that had been taught for generations that survival meant submission was now discovering that survival could mean sovereignty. That growth didn't require approval from Paris, Brussels, or Washington. That dignity wasn't something given by outside forces. It was something reclaimed from within. This transformation wasn't happening without sacrifice. Inflation remained a constant threat. Security risks loomed. The absence of Western aid meant every success had to be earned the hard way. Yet against all odds, the people stayed resilient. And with every passing day, every completed project, every new investor who chose to believe, the old narrative died a little more. Burkina Faso's success stands as a direct challenge to the established world order. It is a living, breathing proof that the supposed rules of development, the need for perpetual aid, foreign debt, and outside validation, are not laws of nature. They are choices. Choices designed to benefit the powerful. And now, a much bigger, much more uncomfortable question hangs heavy in the air. If Burkina Faso can thrive under siege, what excuse do the rest of us have? Why do larger, wealthier African nations, Nigeria, South Africa, Ghana, still cling so tightly to the illusion that they cannot survive without Western aid? Why do leaders continue to play by rules written by those who never had their interests at heart? Burkina Faso has shown the world that dependency is not destiny. That even under crushing pressure, a nation with courage and vision can forge its own path. That freedom isn't something granted, it's something fought for, bled for, built from the ground up by those who refuse to surrender. Yet even as Burkina Faso celebrates its victories, the leadership understands a hard truth. The real battle is only just beginning. Paying off the debt was a monumental step, but maintaining true independence, economic, political, and psychological, will be an endless fight. Every success will be met with new challenges. Every gain will invite new attacks from those who benefit from the old system. The enemies of true sovereignty are patient, well-funded, and relentless. And so Burkina Faso must remain vigilant. It must continue to innovate, to invest, to inspire trust not just through words, but through visible, tangible progress. It must resist the temptations of quick fixes and easy compromises. It must choose every day to believe in itself, even when the world refuses to. But perhaps most importantly, it must serve as a beacon, a reminder to the rest of Africa and to the world that another way is possible, because in the end, this isn't just Burkina Faso's story. It's a blueprint, a warning, a revolution waiting to spread. And as the dust settles and new battles loom, one truth remains unshakable. The old world is dying. A new one is struggling to be born, and those brave enough to believe to truly believe, will be the ones who shape. And the question is, who will have the courage to follow? Stay tuned. Burkina Faso's victory was more than a headline. It was a spark, a defiant signal to a world that had grown comfortable seeing Africa through the lens of dependency. They paid off a crushing $479 billion in debt without begging for Western help. They turned inward when the world slammed the doors shut. They bet everything on themselves, and they won. But make no mistake, this is not the end of the story. It's just the beginning. Because what Burkina Faso achieved is not just a national triumph, it's a blueprint for an entire continent. A warning shot fired across the bow of a system that has kept Africa economically shackled for generations. A whisper growing louder. We don't have to live like this anymore. The question now isn't whether Burkina Faso can survive without Western aid. They've already proven they can. The real question is far bigger, far more dangerous to the old world order. Will Africa finally break free? Will other nations with far greater resources, larger populations, stronger economies, dare to follow? Will countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa finally see the truth staring them in the face? That their wealth, their power, their future doesn't lie in the hands of distant creditors or foreign capitals, but within their own borders, their own people, their own relentless will? Or will they cling to the comfort of dependency, the illusion of security, trading sovereignty for survival one loan agreement at a time? This is the crossroads where history is made. And it's not just a battle of policy, it's a battle of mindset. The old systems of debt and control are crumbling. But something new, something raw and powerful is rising from the dust. Africa Rising isn't just a slogan anymore. It's a storm gathering strength, and it's coming whether the world is ready or not. So now we turn to you. In this new era taking shape before our eyes, where will you stand? Will you choose freedom, self-reliance, and sovereignty? Or will you choose comfort, dependency, and the slow erosion of dignity? Comment below, freedom or dependence? What would you fight for? Because next time, we're going even deeper. We'll uncover the hidden rebellions brewing across Africa, the quiet revolutions happening in places like Nigeria, Ghana, Mali, and beyond, the leaders, the movements, the strategies you've never been told about, the ones rewriting the future while the old world tries desperately to hold on. The rising storm has only just begun, and those brave enough to ride it will change history forever. Stay tuned.